Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
When we say the word sin, most people think immediately of a private individual offense against God, breaking one of God's laws. But very often, as heavy and moralistic as it remained very private. Sin was a matter of what was in my heart and my offense against Almighty God. And I think that is the proper use of that word sin. But the liberation theologians and others these days have introduced another notion to us, and that is the idea of social sin. And what they've shown us is that the sinful actions of people throughout history have gotten embedded in the structures of our world, that systems are very often evil, that systems can be enslaving to other human beings, so that sin takes on sort of an objective reality.
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections is Father Bernard Goff, the pastor of St. Teresa Parish in Toledo. Today's reflections focuses on the topic of social sin and liberation. Here's Father Bacik.
Bernie, thanks for taking time out of a busy schedule to come and speak with me a bit. I think over the years we have been friends now since seminary days, many years, and in a way I think you've been sort of a conscience for the rest of the clergy in the diocese. Over the years you've been always engaged in the social apostolate, interested in helping the downtrodden and the oppressed in our diocese, and sort of kept before the rest of us the social dimension of the gospel. I think that's something that I've always appreciated. I remember your trip to Selma and talking to you when you came back from the civil rights demonstrations, and sort of have kept us in touch with what is going on in that area. So it's been much appreciated, and it sort of directs our attention to the whole social dimension of the gospel, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that, about what the gospel has to say about liberation, about helping the downtrodden and the poor, how those of us who have it made in this society are supposed to respond to the gospel. And I'd like to slant it in terms of the whole notion of social sin. When we say the word sin, most people think immediately of a private individual offense against God, breaking one of God's laws. When Christianity is preached in a heavy and moralistic way, it very often is given a very negative tone, so that one is very worried about committing sins. The great fear is that one might get damned to hell and that fail to achieve the heavenly reward that was promised for us. But very often, as heavy and moralistic as it remained very private. Sin was a matter of what was in my heart and my offense against Almighty God. And I think that is the proper use of that word sin. But the liberation theologians and others these days have introduced another notion to us, and that is the idea of social sin. And what they've shown us is that the sinful actions of people throughout history have gotten embedded in the structures of our world, that systems are very often evil, that systems can be enslaving to other human beings, so that sin takes on sort of an objective reality. It's not just something that goes in one's heart and between oneself and God, and that's the end of it. It's more like dropping the pebble in the water. That it has a ripple effect. And very often it embeds itself in the structures and systems in which we live. So social sin probably could best be exemplified for us in the United States in terms of slavery. Something that was often justified out of the biblical tradition. People would say, well, it was proper to have slaves because of one particular Bible verse or another. Very often people ended up justifying this slavery system on an understanding of Jesus Christ as being the Savior of these people, and that these people would get to heaven and they needed to be cared for and so on. So if we want a model or an image, an example of what social sin is all about, we probably best could point to the whole area of slavery. But that's a past phenomenon in the United States, and officially and legally, and so the idea would be to look at our society today and see where we find examples of this social sin. So, Bernie, I wonder if you might want to comment a bit on that notion out of your own experience as a pastor of a Central City parish, and how you've seen maybe social or institutional systemic sin operative in our world today.
I would say, exemplifying that along the same lines there, our Constitution gave only 3/5 of a person, something like this. They didn't count every slave as a full person, and that would be another illustration of that kind of social sin. I guess from my own experience and the things we have to deal with in our own society today, racism would be a sin. It's that prejudicial judgment about a particular class of people, in this case mostly blacks, but any minority, that kind of racism which says the white society, the white culture is the best, and we have to make everything to be that, and everyone has to fit into that, and that's the dominant society, and that's the one that's going to be the ruling. And then those who are not of that class or that society or that nationality, then somehow they are second-class citizens. And I think we see this. The adage is always saying the blacks are the last hired and the first fired. That maybe with all the laws that are being passed, that may be modified a little bit, but there's still a kind of a discrimination, as I would see, against blacks in our country. You see it in real estate practices, in terms of the ability, and I've heard this so many times, people would call up to buy a home, and this was before there's more dispersion of the blacks throughout the city, but nonetheless it still continues to some degree.
That they would not have the opportunity to buy the home.
Either to buy the home, or if they call up and ask for the price of the home, when they would appear, then they would say either the price would go up or the person would say it's been sold. And so that system, or that those kind of actions would be able to be continued. That I've heard a Vietnam veteran come back and said, look, I went over fighting for freedom in America, and now I come back home and I can't get a home. I feel like taking up a gun against America, and I can understand how that is. Or the young man who gets his college education a few years ago and went out looking for a job. It was before the blacks were hired in offices, and this young man tells me he's been looking all over for a job, and he went through his whole experience. He says, if I just get my education, he went to a local high school, and get my education, went to college, got his education, came back home, started looking around, couldn't find any, finally called up for an accountant. He walked in, and when they saw he was black, said the job was still open. When he walked in, the guy said, we just hired it. And when I had been talking to that young man, he'd been working 6 months in a warehouse hauling coffee bags, because he said, I've given up the struggle. I can't fight any longer against that. That is institutional racism, which says this man, because of the color of his skin, is not competent to do books, although he has a college degree. And it is those things. And as long as the gospel is preached only to the individual, without trying to see some of the injustices of the structures in society, as long as we deal only with the individual, so the president or the real estate person or someone else says, well, I can't do anything about it because this is the way the practices are. And so they can excuse themselves, but somehow the society and the structures continue to oppress people.
I think one of the interesting things that I've seen about that is that it really doesn't matter who is running these systems or structures. They still end up oppressing. In other words, you could get all good Christian people into positions of authority and power, but still bad things would happen to individuals as a result, because the system itself would carry this social sin. Probably ought to try to exemplify that again. I guess you could think of people in multinational corporations who would be very good people and very kind to the people who work for them, and even very just in their hiring practices and so on. But at times, it would appear, at least from one vantage point, that the way the corporation itself operates on the profit motive is going to end up hurting some people. You can take the kind of analysis that people like Frances LaPay made, and I'm not sure everyone would agree with this, but her idea is that multinationals go into a third world country and force them to grow or produce certain products that will sell back in the United States, thereby taking away from them the opportunity to grow their own food. So that if they're growing all bananas in Jamaica to export to the United States, for our benefit, then they can't be growing on their plots of land the kind of food they need to subsist on. So it doesn't matter if the multinational has good Christian people at the head or not. It still is moved by the profit motive, and therefore it ends up somehow hurting people. Now, I'm not sure I picked a terrific example, but I think the principle holds that very often we feel stuck in a system and we say, well, what could we do about it? I mean, there's really no change that could be made here. No, we might say in a Catholic church, well, we would like to have more blacks who are in leadership positions. But as a matter of fact, that doesn't seem to happen, just because of the way the whole institution has functioned in the United States over the years.
Who appoints to the boards and who appoints the decision makers? It's the presumption. So they get some friends and some people they know and their contacts and the people they know are reputable and are qualified and this sort of thing, and they don't reach out to look for qualified others who are qualified from a different race or a different nationality, whatever it may be, or a different cultural background, and so that the system continues to be unjust and eliminate or oppress or dominate a certain segment of society.
I suppose one of the saddest things in our own time, isn't it, that it appears as though we are not making great progress with the minorities in our country. I mean, we've passed civil rights laws and we have voting rights acts and so on, and it appears as though there's certain good things that have happened, but the way I read the limited literature that I deal with, it seems to suggest that we are not making progress, that the minorities are not moving forward in terms of equality in the United States on the socioeconomic scale. Maybe there's some dispute about that, I'm not really sure, but that's an impression I get from my own limited reading, that the gap is still there. In fact, some people would claim the gap is even growing, that despite our legal advances, that still black teenage unemployment, for example, a really frightening statistic in the United States. I forget, isn't it get up to almost 40% or something like that?
I think up to 22 or something like that. I don't know exactly what the statistics are, but it's much higher than the white counterparts.
Right.
So that you say that somehow, if you're a young black man in this society, you have much less of a chance of getting a job and maintaining a job than if you're a white counterpart. And it's just, that's one of the facts. So that there seems to be something unjust about that, and how to go about changing that, unless there is some kind of a view, some kind of a philosophy, some kind of a theology, which says we have to try to do something about that. And I think liberation theology is raising our consciousness of the fact that any kind of domination by anybody, whether it's an individual or an institution, anyone who dominates anyone else is contrary to the spirit of the gospel, the message of Jesus, who came to preach an equality in his kingdom and a different set of values. And
I think one of the important things that the liberation theologians remind us of is that no structure is sacrosanct, no structure is essential, no system can never be tampered with. In other words, they're suggesting to us that the Christian outlook says we have to always be trying to improve the structures in which we live, that systems need to be altered at times so that they no longer oppress people. I think very often that a classical kind of Christian viewpoint said that many of the structures of the state, for example, the divine right of kings, or the notion that Christianity is necessarily tied to capitalism as an economic system, for example, has all made those kind of systems sacred. It's made it sound as though the Christians have to be for the status quo always. The liberation theologians are insisting, no, that God is the one who does new and surprising things in our midst, that he's the one who calls us to improve the structures in which we live, that we have to fight for a more just distribution of the goods in our world.
I think you would see that in terms of some of the kind of the slogans you see on the bumper stickers, that America, whatever America does, is good for everybody. And I think if you listen to other countries in the world, I think we have to begin at least to hear what they're saying, and that may not be true. What is good for America is not always what is best for the rest of the world, and we use the most energy, and when the petroleum prices went up, that means the nitrogen that comes out of the petroleum is taken away for fertilizer, and the hungry India or someplace like this couldn't afford to buy the the petroleum products because of the price was forced up so high, because of Americans' demand for this, so that we say America in her standard of living and the use of these things is resulting in the oppression of other people who are going hungry because they have to use the same that challenge for this. Or you hear what is good for GM is good for the country, and that just may not be true. And liberation theology is saying that may not be, as you suggest, the institution is not sacrosanct, the structure is not good in itself maybe, and we have to at least question this, and it is the role of the theologian and the role of the person of faith to begin to critique this, and it doesn't mean because we question America or we question General Motors or any large corporation that we somehow have anything against them, but by the same token, from their perspective, as they do things, they end up oppressing people sometimes without even realizing it.
I think that's the big
practices.
point. It's very often without realizing it.
We're not passing moral judgment on them
right.
and saying that they...
that's a part of the consciousness raising. I mean, just that pure statistic that's often thrown around that we in the United States are 6% of the world's population and consume 40% of the resources. I mean, to hear that is very challenging. I mean, you can't just set it aside and say, yeah, we're lucky, we're God's people, and we're the chosen ones, and we've got it made. That's one kind of reaction. The other is to sort of just numb oneself to it and say, well, yeah, I won't pay much attention to it. But if you let it come into your mind and heart, it really is a shocking kind of idea when we think of how many people really are hungry in the world and homeless and so on, and we are consuming this much. I mean, I know some people who take that really seriously and decide in their own life they're going to change. They try to live a simpler lifestyle. I know families who have done that. I mean, who would refuse to have air conditioners or wouldn't have a television set in their house and would try to buy simple food or belong to food co-ops and so on, just because they want to somehow set up another style of living and not just fall into the trap of being the 6% who consume 40% of the world's goods. But I think it's really hard to hear that message. I mean, we don't usually link that with Christianity. And that, again, as the liberation theologians are telling us, there's a social dimension to the gospel. It has political and economic consequences. And it's hard to keep that in front of ourselves. I mean, we live such an easy life, those of us who are middle-class Americans. We have it made, and the status quo is good for us. And to hear people talking about changing that somehow is hard to take. One begins to wonder what will happen in the world as we consume more and more and as there's less to consume. I mean, I wonder if there aren't pragmatic reasons why we have to be concerned with this problem. I mean, how long, what do we do when the oil does run out, for example, and where we can't count on other people giving us the thing? What if the third world revolts in some way or finds their own power? My mentor, Karl Rahner, suggests that really the world is in a revolutionary situation in which the southern part of the world is against the northern part. The southern part of the world has no power, has no ability to achieve its own well-being and so on, and that we're in what he calls a revolutionary situation. And I wonder if he isn't very realistic about that. That's a long-term view, and we usually think in short-term, but I think it's to be considered. I think maybe what we ought to get at, too, is the real positive response we want to make to all this, and that is that the law of love, as it's preached to us in the gospel, suggests that we do good for the neighbor. Now, very often we've interpreted that in private terms, like we want to give a food basket to somebody who's poor at Thanksgiving time. And I think what we're beginning to recognize today when we analyze social sin is that love of neighbor at that level isn't sufficient. That's a good thing to do, and all of us ought to be helping those we see in need. But love of neighbor today would suggest that we work for institutional changes, that we try to see if there aren't reversals of governmental policies, for example. I think of Bread for the World organization, where people join and try to lobby Congress in order to get a better distribution of the world's goods. I mean, you think one enactment by Congress would do so much more than all the private contributions to CARE or to the relief fund and so on. One thing changed by our government in terms of foreign aid would just could make a great difference. So Bread for the World says, let's put our energy in there. let's gather a lot of people who will lobby Congress to get these kind of legal changes so that we will take better care of the third world.
Mm-hmm. I think, as you pointed out, the problem is that we become very comfortable in the situation we're in, and we are reluctant to try to move off dead center. And it is so challenging. The future is uncertain. If we begin to take some of these considerations, it means we're going to have to change. And it looks like as long as we're going on the way we are, we can somehow, it's more safe, it's more secure if we try to hang on to what we have, and rather than chart out into some of those unknown waters and begin to try to look at things from a different perspective. But I think, as you point out, it's very pragmatic. One of the ways in which I think the fallacy of the kind of institutional or the structural injustice is that we have to produce more, and as we produce more, it's going to trickle down, and the poor are going to share more. And that is not necessarily true. I think statistics will show, and experience has borne this out in Latin America, the separation between the rich and the poor is very great. There isn't any middle class, but I think that statistics will show that there fewer and fewer are getting more and more economic control in the country, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And that somehow the system is organized and the laws are passed, whether it favors the tax-free income of those who buy municipal bonds in $100,000 lots. That's income which is tax-free. And every year the reports are shown of the number of millionaires who pay no taxes. And we have to begin to say, well, where is the justice in that?
Bernie, what do you think about this idea of community organizing in this regard? I know it always fascinates me when I see people sort of take charge of their own lives. You'll hear on television sometimes of a neighborhood that begins to police itself, and they all are on the lookout for crime, and they try to help one another. Or people will get together in a neighborhood and try to fix up the houses and so on. I think very often the Campaign for Human Development, the Catholic effort sponsored by the bishops to get seed money to self-help program for the poor, has a great appeal to me. In other words, where you see, boy, yeah, just with a grant of $50,000 or something, this small group of people can improve their lot in some way. They can get together and get materials for their houses, improve their neighborhood, the houses have higher value, and so on. You know, that is really appealing to me. I realize there's a lot of debate on that, whether that's the way to go or whether we need larger systemic changes. But this idea of small group cooperation fits in with some of our Catholic ideas, the principle of subsidiarity, for example, out of our social encyclicals, that the real action should be done at the local level, that the smaller group should take charge of its own life and so on. I wonder if we have some sort of help on this level.
Well, I think one of the things we're doing practically in terms of St. Teresa's in the school, in terms of trying to help the people, are trying to help the school help themselves, and the parents are contributing more and more in the 7 Central City schools. 6-7 years ago, the parents contributed 28% of the total operating costs. Last year, they produced through tuition and fundraising something like 56%. It is a self-determination, and it's a self-help project, if you will, in terms of helping the people to help themselves. And in the end, that's the dignifying thing, where a person is able to help themselves rather than just trying to do something always for somebody else. But that requires some institutional and some structural adaptations which will enable a person to better himself and to enter into the mainstream of society. You have to empower that person, and that's true. Power has to be used in that way to allow that person to do that. But sometimes under the present laws or practices do not permit that, and therefore someone has to critique that. And I think out of our whole discussion is that it is the liberation theologians who are suggesting to us that there's another way of looking at the Scriptures, and it is the Word of God and the revelation of God and the practice of Jesus and the message of Jesus to try to help people to do this, that they are not dominated by anybody else, that they are free to enter into to share the goods of God's creation.
I wonder if there is improvement at local levels like that. I wonder if that doesn't have some sort of ripple effect again. I'm not sure how large structures respond to improvement at the smaller level, but one would at least hope that would give models for other ways of organizing oneself. We see people helping one another and poor people empowered in our country, and that working, people getting off the welfare rolls and so on. Maybe
Christian hope.
Yeah.
Christian hope. The hope that the Christian has, that faith perspective, which has hope that somehow, as if we are able to live out our potential, that there is a better kind of a relationship that people can come to share in the goods of God's creation.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking, Bernie, about social sin. And so social sin, which is sort of a new phrase in our theological vocabulary, it suggests to us that evil isn't just a private matter between me and God, but that it gets embedded in our institutions and systems. And unfortunately, in our world today, as we look around, we see some people are simply caught up in these unjust structures, and they feel imprisoned. They feel as though they can't get out, and they have no way to turn. And they were suggesting that the Christian gospel has something to say about this. We say that the God we believe in is one who wants his people to be free. We believe in a God who fights against oppression, who wants people to be liberated, who wants to give social and political and economic freedom to his people. We believe in the Lord Jesus, who was the liberator, the one who came to free the captives and to give people a new and better and richer kind of life. And so we're suggesting that that puts the burden on individual Christians today of saying, how can we change the structures? How can we create better situations so that everyone has their opportunity to share in the good gifts that God has given us, and that people can overcome their enslavements and live a truly dignified and human life?
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Bernard Boff, the pastor of St. Teresa Parish in Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was social sin and liberation. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.